Welcome back, kings and queens, to the African alchemy, or introduction to the African alchemy of spirituality as presented by gotkushTV. You just heard from Brother Dalian Adofo, one half of the Ancestral Voices team, teaching you about the understanding of being a force of nature. Excellent, excellent presentation. And actually contributes very, very seamlessly to what it is I'm about to present right about now. I am your next presenter, and I will be addressing the subject of Kimoyo, or African spirituality and nation building, or the power and the art of nation building. Yes, indeed, kings and queens. In fact, your next three presentations, actually, my one, Brother Dalian's, and the next one following from me, which I'll introduce later, actually relate seamlessly to each other. So do pay attention and get involved. And you know what I mean? Let's tune in, yeah, to the energy and the vibration. I do want to dedicate this presentation to my dearly departed sister Auntie Nkechi, because she was always very encouraging about my presentations, and especially when they were spiritually focused, yeah. So I stand here in her energy because she passed away earlier this year. So I'm going to bring the energy of Auntie Nkechi to the presentation right about now. Ashe. And in moving forward, Auntie Nkechi, we met, as members of the Al-Qibla Revivalist Movement. I am a born and raised member of the Al-Qibla Revivalist Movement under the leadership of our spiritual leader, who happens to be my father, Brother Leader Mbandaka. And so I'm saying this to introduce myself, so that you understand that I have a life that is steeped, yeah, in the realms of African spirituality, kings and queens. Moving very quickly, the Al-Qibla Revivalist Movement is based upon the idea that our liberation or our freedom as African people must come from the affirmation, must necessarily come from the affirmation of our culture, because we understand what culture is. And so we're going to define culture first and foremost using the wisdom of Mama Marimba Ani in this great book by the name of Yoruba, an African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior. And she says, Wayne Nobles defines culture as a process which gives a people a general design for living and patterns for interpreting reality. Its aspects, he says, are ideology, ethos, and worldview. Its factors are ontology, cosmology, and axiology, and its manifestations consist of behavior, values, and attitudes. We don't have time to define all of these words here, but we're going to define three of them. And those words are ontology, which basically means how people view themselves and their nature of being. Cosmology, how people view the nature of the universe and their place in it. And axiology, based upon ontology and cosmology, people derive their primary views and values, a set of values by which they live and develop a culture, and is reinforced in the culture that they develop. All right? So, we understand that spirituality is the highest expression of culture. In other words, spirituality is the elevation of the primary views and values of a culture to the realm of the divine. And so we quote from Baba Yosef Ben Yekanin in saying that religion is the deification of a people's culture. Therefore, the religion empowers the people within whose culture the religion is expressed. All of the values that we see in a religious context are the primary ones of the culture, elevated to the realm of the divinity and given a sacred representation through how they are viewed and treated within a culture. So, we understand from the teachings of Mama Frances Quest Wilson that culture impacts all areas of people activity. Culture impacts education, economics, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, war, counter-war, and education. And in turn, all of these areas of people activity in turn reinforce the culture. Yes? They evolve the culture. The people's activity in all of these areas of people activity in turn reinforce and evolve the culture. So, we get to this word Kimoyo. You heard me earlier say Kimoyo, yes? And the art or the power of nation building. Kimoyo is a word that we find in our ancient Kikongo language, which is still used today. And in fact, you'll find the word Kimoyo in this film, Black Panther. They have a thing called the Kimoyo beads that they wear around their wrist. But most of us did not know that Kimoyo was not made up in Black Panther. Kimoyo is actually a word, yes, in the Kikongo language, and it means dynamo vitalism, or of the spirit. So we go forward, it's explaining this with the words of Baba Kimbwadende Kiamon Sekifukia in the book Self-Healing Power and Therapy. And he says, Moyo means vital power. This vital power, Moyo, came to exist on earth after Futu was completely tied up. Yeah, that's the basically, the Futu is the what keeps the earth in order, okay? The rope that keeps the earth in order, or the universe in order. The Futu and its contents, were ready to secure life to be born on earth. Moyo in this language, Kikongo, sorry, we're getting some technicals in, is a universal matter. It is something both inside and outside. Moyo is what is the vitality of life. It is the key word to Kibantu, the Bantu way of life, their philosophy. Kimoyo, vitalism, is their religion and not animism. We're emphasizing this because we have been given many misconceptions about our spiritual traditions, and they refer to them as animism. Baba Kimbwa Dennekia Mosaki Fukia was saying that our spirituality is about vitalism. It's about tapping into and channeling the vital essence of the self, which in the Kikongo language is referred to as Moyo. So Kimoyo, Kim being the prefix, meaning related to, meaning of. So our spirituality is about revitalizing ourselves as beings of life, the energy of life. So Kimoyo we use to refer to African spirituality, as we begin to re-Africanize ourselves and use our own language to define these concepts. And so within the concept of Kimoyo, we understand that Kimoyo, or as we might say in Kemetu, or as we might say in Yoruba, Ashe, was the energy through which the Creator created the creation. And so this is exemplified within the context of the Medjuneta, with the words that were declared by Ra during the creation. Thus said Ra, Lord of all, Lord of the utmost limits, after he had come into being. I am the one who came into being as Keper. Keper is an aspect of the divine creator that relates to continued evolution, revitalization, and rejuvenation. He who came into being and brings into being. When I came into being, being itself came into being. Right? It says, he who comes into being and brings into being. When I came into being, being itself came into being. All beings came into being after I came into being. Now, this is serious, kings and queens here. Why is this here? Kimoyo and the art of nation building. Because in essence, we are creative beings, and everything that we create is a reflection of the self. Okay? Everything that we create is a reflection of the self. Our divine essence allows us to recreate ourselves within the creation. This is the command of Ra according to himself, and we understand ourselves as manifestations of Ra, therefore we do the same. To continue, if I may, it is Ptah, a form of Ra, the most great, who has given existence to all divine powers and to their essences through his heart and mind and tongue. Thus it came to pass that the heart, mind, and tongue ruled all the other members through teaching that Ptah, Ra, is within everybody as heart and mind, and within every mouth as tongue. all the divine powers of humankind, the cattle of all creeping things, and of all living things, and he thinks as heart and mind and commands as tongue whatever he wishes. So this teaching from our ancient Originetta tells us that the essence or the divine will of the Creator exists within us, and we are able to express things into being in as much as the Creator was able to. So the things that we say and the things that we do are who we are and what we become. But this operates not just on the individual level, it also operates on the collective level. And most of us tend to stay confined to the individual, especially when we're dealing with spirituality. We want to use spirituality and ritual to achieve money, good sexual relationships, to bond bad mind, and get rid of enemies. We seem to be able to understand spirituality within that context. But when it comes to using our spiritual traditions to build schools, to build not just businesses but economies, and to develop those things, institutions, into nations, we don't seem as well adjusted to use and employ our spiritual gifts towards achieving those ends. And so this is where I want to go next, kings and queens, as we go into the substance of this presentation. The first part is understanding our connection to each other as African people. I love the Adinka symbols that we find among the Akan people in West Africa. And one of the symbols of the Adinka is this, Anansi Ntonta. And Anansi Ntonta is a symbol that represents Anansi the spider. And as an African from Jamaica, I'm particularly drawn to this concept because Anansi is one of the traditions that is most well preserved in our African diaspora experience and understanding of our spirituality. And we see here that Anansi Ntonta is a symbol of wisdom, creativity, and the complexities of life. But we can see it's a visual representation of a spider's web. But we don't just find that concept in our Akan or Ashanti ancestry. We also find it in Central Africa with the Kikongo. And this is called Lukosi, yeah? Again, defined as the environmental square is one's net of survival or web of survival. I've lost the screen again. I don't think it's up there. It's saying link it. I got it. Yeah. Right. So to explain this little piece further, yeah, reading from a paper by Baba Kimpa Nenda Seki Fukia, he says, to control one's square, Kizungidila, from within, requires a total knowledge of the whole Kizungidila, yeah, which means creating physical, mystical, spiritual, and even telepathic means of communication throughout all of its corners. These Minieni rays, yeah, become one's power force, not only of communication, but also of control within and outside as well. This means constitutes his, Miakese, yeah, antenna. Once his main ensemble bridges, diagonals, installed across his square, well, with his Unkudulu, natural growth, the art of making one's Kikulu history, man makes of his environment a Lukosi Lua Zingu, a net of survival. Now, I always love quoting from Baba Kimba because he uses very common words, and sometimes it can be difficult, yet for the untrained tongue. But it means that we're learning to think, yes, using the language in very organic ways. He continues. This Lukosi net helps him make his life possible in his environment, no matter how hostile or poor that environment may be. This Lukosi, in other words, signifies assembly of knowledge and techniques required in order to control a given environment and be able to survive its conditions socially, politically, and economically. This Mposi Lua Zingu, web of life. Remember the Anatsi depiction that we heard seen earlier? It's the web of life. Became at once his net, his pitfall, and his ndogo daki hook, which helps him to catch his prey, build his shelter, save his food, fight against his enemies, control his fertility, and more. Thanks to this web of life, he can move and communicate within and outside of his Kinzinko Dela, the world square. And so we're seeing here an appreciation of a spiritual concept that relates to our political and economic reality. I hope that speaks for itself. I'm going to skip that next slide and go on to understanding how disconnecting from our ancestral source is a key factor, in destroying what Baba Kipadende is talking about in terms of Kizungundela. Yes? And Sheikh Adudiyah teaches us in the book Civilization or Barbarism. He says, we have earlier said that a people without a historical conscience is a population. The loss of national sovereignty and of historical conscience following a prolonged foreign occupation engenders stagnation or even sometimes regression, disintegration, and the partial return to barbarism. So he's saying that without our historical conscience, and you don't have a historical conscience if you are disconnected from your ancestors, brothers and sisters. So in essence, we have to understand what we would call history. We need to distinguish between two levels, he says. The immediate one of the local history, so there and deeply lived, in which the African peoples, segmented by diverse exterior forces, the principle of which is colonization, are shriveled up, find themselves trapped and are vegetating today. A second level, more general, further off in time and space, and including the totality of our people, comprising the general history of that Africa insofar as research permits, restoring it today from a purely scientific approach. Each history is thus pinpointed and correctly situated in relation to the general historical coordinates. Thus, all the continent's history is re-evaluated according to a new unitary standard situated to revive and to cement on the basis of established fact all the inner elements of the ancient historical mosaic. So what we're seeing here is the idea that in order to be truly ourselves, both individually and collectively, we must have a connection to our ancestors. We must have a connection to our history. Yes? But not just on the individual level, but on the collective level. Now we've got a few examples of this. We've got a few examples of this. The first I'm going to raise is Palmares in Brazil. We often talk about Haiti in 1804 when our ancestors, started a revolution in 1791 built upon the foundation of our spiritual traditions known as voodoo or Voodoo, ways a successful revolution. But often many of us don't know that a couple hundred years before Haiti, there was Palmares in Brazil, whereby our ancient ancestors revolted within the context of enslavement in Brazil and formed a self-sufficient nation, that was 1/3 the size of Portugal and lasted for over 100 years. And it's called Palmares, liberated free African state, lasted from 1595 approximately to 1695 approximately, consisted of over 30,000 people, and it was built on land approximately 1/3 the size of Portugal and successfully resisted Portuguese and Dutch invasions for over 50 years. Imagine, in the context of enslavement, we find in the middle of Brazil, one of the biggest enslaved nations that we know about, a nation of free Africans in the context of slavery. We could talk about Haiti, as I mentioned already. We could talk about even the revolts that were not fully successful, like, for example, Taki's rebellion in Jamaica. Like, for example, Sam Sharp, Paul Bogle, Denmark, Vesey, Nat Turner. And if we look at all of those, one you will find two dynamics. The first is an African spiritual component, and the second is a nation-building agenda. Yes? You cannot divorce the spirituality from the political. So, moving quickly. Going back to self-healing power, from Baba Kimoyo, he says, African society in general, and the Bantu in particular, perceive a human as a power, a phenomenon of perpetual veneration, from conception to death. Perpetual veneration from, a perpetual reality that cannot be denied, and more so after death, because this physical reality becomes a spiritually living reality in words, deeds, experience, image, and invisible radiating sun. Each of us are born as radiating suns. As such, a pregnant woman is perceived as the carrier of a new and holy package full of power and energy, a continuation genetically of old traditions under a new form. The entire community awaits the coming of the package, the infant or the muntu to be born. Muntu is the individual human being, and in the collective this is described as Ubuntu, as Brother Dalian was relating earlier, and so we get the concept or the saying which seems to have disappeared from the presentation, but the saying Muntu, Unga Muntu, Unga Bantu, which means a person, there we go, is a person because they are people. A person is a person because they are people. We see ourselves essentially as part of collectives, not individuals separated and segmented from a connection to each other and the universe. So, one of the things that reinforces these ideas and these values are rituals. As Mama Marimba Ali teaches, African life is replete with ritual. It states interrelationship with other beings in the universe. Ritual sacrifice symbolizes the principles of interdependence and reciprocity. It is through ritual that the unexplained is understood, that chaos is made to be ordered within the logic of tradition. It is through ritual that trauma is avoided, crises dealt with and overcome, and difficult transitions are perceived as passages between stages of normal growth and development. So now we're going to conclude by looking at how our ancestors, even in the Ma'afa, enslavement, oppression, used ritual to reinforce who they were, not just individually, but collectively, and reform, stabilize families, stabilize communities, and stabilize nations that were antithetical to the condition that they were in at that time. Taken from a paper written by a sister by the name of Diane M. Stewart, entitled Kumina, a spiritual vocabulary of nationhood in Victorian Jamaica. She says, an ironic juxtaposition existed between the British Empire politics of sovereignty and that of the Kumina nation. Many of us see Kumina as just a religion, but the Kumina people are a nation. While the ever-expanding Victorian British Empire sought to absorb African nations into its colonial polities, under various arrangements in the late 19th century, Central Africans in Jamaica and other exiles in the Caribbean and the Americas did not abandon their own nation politics. They engaged in nation-building practices that held currency for them as enslaved and colonial subjects, discovering their potential to self-govern even while toiling under British imperial governance. These nation practices included holding native judiciary courts, hosting coronation pageants, and assuming royal titles. Certainly, Queen Victoria died without ever knowing the names and power of the late 19th century Kumina queen. Queens. These women, their names now lost, were predecessors of figures like Queenie Espute, who reigned in the mid-20th century over the Central African Jamaican linguistically related nations of Moyenge, Muchunde, Congo, Mondongo, and Mumbaka. In 1946, like far too many of her overworked and warded compatriots, 47-year-old Queenie Espute prematurely crossed the Kalunga, which I'll explain a little bit later. The watery boundary dividing the worlds of the living and the dead in Congo cosmology, whether conceived as the Atlantic Ocean or as other bodies of water, Kalunga in Kumina culture signifies the point of entry to Mpemba, the lower world of the invisible powers, ancestors and deities. Immediately glosses the concepts of immensity and immeasurability. Taking her first breath in 1899, just months before Queen Victoria's last in 1901, Queenie Espute defies death and again returning to Kumina ceremonies in St. Thomas to dance life's circular path with her descendants. One thing to explain here. When you see Moyenge, Machunde, Congo, Mondongo, and Mumbaka, these are all sub-nations within the Congo nation that are the names of the ancestors of the Congo people in Jamaica. They call them saltwater bongos, yeah? And bearing in mind that Rastafari inherited this tradition, when you hear the Rastafari talk about Nati Congo and Bongo, that's an inheritance, yeah, from the Kumina tradition in Jamaica, in St. Thomas in particular. So let's go wrap up this thing very quickly. What you see here is what you call the Dikenga, yeah? It's a cosmogram, yeah, that gives expression to the Kikongo understanding of life, yeah? The color is coming into life in the physical realm, okay? The Tukala is the maturing of life, yes, in this physical realm. And the November is the ascendancy into the spiritual realm, and the Mosoni is being the state of being in the physical realm. Sorry, the spiritual realm, or the unseen realm. Kumpemba is the unseen. Technicals again. I've lost the signal. I'm going to need it. 1 second. All right. Yes, I've got it. Right. Kumpemba is the unseen realm, the ancestral realm, the realm of the divinities. Yeah. Kunseke is the physical realm, the seen realm. All right. And so, in essence, in the Kikongo cosmology, life is considered to be revolving around these patterns. Yeah. Relationship between the physical and the immaterial, the seen and the unseen. And the Kalunga is the, I don't want to say barrier, yes, but it can be conceived of as the barrier between the seen and the unseen. In another sense, Kalunga is considered to be the fiery force complete unto itself, which means that the physical and the immaterial are seen as inseparable. They're not seen as distinct from each other. Right. So, what I want to do now is show you, and there should be sound on this, how our Kikonga ancestors reinforce that understanding through this ritual. Yeah? There should be some sound in this, but yeah, you can't hear the sound, right? But check it out. Where it's plugged into the computer, that level there should be some sound. Alright? So, what we see here is the Kumina ritual. In the middle you find two drummers aside each other. They represent the Kalunga. Yes? And you can see the dancers dance in a spiraling motion, there we go, circumambulating the drummers counterclockwise. So every time they go around, they rebirth into the physical realm. Yes? They are birthed into the spiritual realm. And the dance represents that continued birth and death over time. And if you notice, they don't just circumambulate the kalunga, yes, or the drummers. They spin on their own axis, yes, like the planets in the universe, yeah. So in doing this, they are calling their ancestors, as I mentioned earlier, Moyenge, yeah, Manoka Mvula, and others. And through this, they are reinforcing themselves as a nation distinct from the colonial nation that many of us were born into. At this time, when our ancestors were doing this, it was King George and Queen Victoria and them people there. But the Kikonga had their own king and queen. And our Rastafari ancestors inherited that tradition and said, well, we have our own king and queen. We are not pledging allegiance to King George or Queen Victoria any longer. We're reinforcing our own nationhood. And so, kings and queens, that concludes the presentation for but one slide, in the sense of the fact that our rituals need to not only inspire us to pursue wealth, happiness, money, good sex and relationships, but let us use our rituals to build schools for our children. Let us use our rituals to challenge the institutions and forces of white supremacy. Let us use our rituals to build not just businesses, but build economies and economic systems. And one person who I think is doing some of that work in terms of ritual is Mama Marimba Ani. She has a ritual annually every year called Abakosem Sumsum. And she refers to it as a spiritual political process, from praise song to African spiritual warfare on to world African sovereignty. And she says the purpose of Abakosem Sumsum is not to make us feel comfortable, but to challenge us to grow in African sovereign consciousness. Abakosem Sumsum will cause you to ask and answer the question, how will I live from this moment, I should say, forward, so that my life brings my people closer to African sovereignty? I am saying and I'm suggesting that we need more rituals and more spiritual consciousness that reveals to us not just our individual purposes, but our collective purposes. That not just inspires us to individually de-stress, yes, and get rid of whatever is ailing us on the individual level, but to collectively heal, and not just heal, but produce, to recreate ourselves in this reality for our children and our prosperity. Bibi Fahodie, African Liberation Kings and Queens, and thank you very much.